So I'm just curious, how many of you noticed the boxes of tissues sitting here when you came in? And maybe thought, oh shoot, they're going to make me cry. So just to reassure you, it's not my agenda to make anybody cry or not cry. What I do hope for our time together that we have today, which is short, I see looking at the clock, is just an opportunity for us to pause together. As we were getting ready to get started this morning, I was talking with a couple of dear friends, and we were talking about how often life just kind of moves along rather quickly. And I know for those of you who are students, not to mention those of you who are faculty and staff, that that's really true this time of year, right? Next week is Dead Week. Is that accurate? Or is it 2 weeks? 2 weeks? Didn't mean to scare you there. And then you have finals coming up, not to mention all of the holiday stuff, right? It's just a lot. And sometimes things happen to us that maybe are like difficult or disturbing or worrisome or painful, and we don't actually have time to pause and process them, right? So we were talking about how sometimes when we're in a situation like this, a lot of emotions do come up just because we often don't take time. And sometimes we purposely avoid taking time to pause and feel what we need to feel and process in the ways we need to process and share with God and with each other. So sometimes when we do have time to pause like this, kind of take that collective breath together as a community, we will feel various things, and that's okay, whatever they are. Whatever you experience during this time together or don't, whether it's a thinking time for you or a feeling time for you or some of both, that's great, because God knows what your heart needs today. If we could go around the room as we get started today. I'm sorry, I've got just this little kind of coffee tickle thing today. If we could go around the room, and each person, if we had time to do this, and each of you to share something that is one of your favorite things about the holiday season and something that is one of your least favorite things about the holiday season. Wouldn't that be interesting to do if we had time to hear that for everyone? Or maybe we could even do several. So some of your favorite things, some of your least favorite things about the holiday season. We would get a lot of different answers. Somebody might say, I really like the festiveness and the lights and the music, but I don't really love the materialism. I really like some of the good food, but I don't like having to go back to the gym in January. I really like the idea I have in my head of this sort of warm, magical season, but one of my least favorite things is that sometimes when I'm with my people during the Christmas time, it doesn't actually feel as warm and magical as I hoped it would. Or somebody might say one of my favorite things is being with family, but I don't get to be with my family this year. So one of my least favorite things is being away from loved ones. Somebody might even say one of my favorite things is going home. And one of my least favorite things is going home. Right? We can even actually feel both of those things at the same time. Something that's our favorite can actually also be our least favorite thing. Somebody might say, I love thinking about Jesus coming to earth, but I don't understand why God lets these painful things happen to me. So what if we took all of those, and I'm hoping that you're thinking of your own, my favorite is this, but my least favorite is this. You may have several of them. So let's each hold those just collectively in our minds. And let's think, what if we were to switch the word but out for the word and? How would that change the meaning of the things that we're holding? For example, I really like the festiveness and the lights of Christmas, And I don't love the materialism. That's a different meaning, right? Because it allows us to do a thing that we call holding both. If you say but, that implies I have to put away one or the other. But if you say and, that means you get to hold both. And we're going to talk in a little bit about why this is Jesus' message to us, the word and. What if you were able to say, I really love going to be with my family for Christmas, and it brings up some painful memories. What if you were to allow yourself to hold both? What if, as the body of Christ, we allowed ourselves and each other to say, I am really suffering. I'm in emotional pain to the point of despair. And I have hope in Jesus. What if one did not eliminate the other? What if it was all about the and? Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. I have a little tickle in my throat, and now I have something to drink. Thank you. One of the first times that I realized that I was really missing this and thing in my life, this and way of looking at Jesus, was a number of years ago when we first moved to Boise. And one of the first friends that I made here was a woman who had arrived here through refugee resettlement. And she was a person who spoke Swahili, so I had gotten to know her through interpreting for her trauma therapy. And I went to visit her at her house one day, and she was talking just about her home, and she lived in an apartment with her kids, single mom. And something that she said in her own mind reminded her of something very painful. We weren't talking about her trauma story, which, by the way, I'm not going to tell any trauma stories today, just for you to know. The only story that's mine to tell is my own. So I'm not going to be telling any trauma stories or talking about any specific forms of trauma, because we don't need to do that in order to help ourselves to learn to lean into the and of Jesus. But I was visiting her, and something that she said, maybe a sentence she said, maybe a word she said, I don't even know for sure what it was that kind of triggered that response for her. But she started remembering some very, very difficult things that she had been through. And she started crying and kind of telling me a little bit about, oh, this is making me remember this. And the longer she sat there, and I just sat, not partly because I didn't know what to do. Sometimes the best thing to do when you don't know what to do is nothing. And she started crying, and the more she started crying, I could see her getting pretty restless, and she was going back in her memories. And for some folks who've experienced some really difficult things, when the difficult memories can come, it can almost be like watching a video in your mind. And I could see that was happening for her. So she was struggling with this, and then she suddenly stood up and said, I need to dance. So she put on some worship music. It wasn't just dance music. And it wasn't like happy club music, like get my mind off of this. It was worship music. And there, just in her living room with only me there, she danced. And danced hard and cried hard and kept dancing and kept crying. But the thing about it was that the dancing was, it was worship. It was quite obvious that this was worship for her. She was praising as she was weeping and lamenting and grieving. And I'm not going to tell you anything again about her trauma story, but it was grief and difficulty beyond what most of us humans even imagine experiencing. So she did this for a while, and then finally she kind of got through this. and came and sat back down. And we were talking about it, and she asked me, because she knew that I was sitting in the room with her. I was praying for her at the time. I was crying with her, but I wasn't dancing. So she asked me, "Don't you dance?" I said, "Well, I do sometimes in praise or prayer, usually like just by myself in my room." I said, "We white people, we don't dance in front of each other very good." We don't. That's a skill that life hasn't brought to us, and boy, could we learn from it. But the interesting thing that she said was that really changed many, many things for me as I began to explore this idea was, when you're hurting, the best thing to do is cry and praise. To cry and dance. It's an and. And I thought about how culturally I am so conditioned to believe that it's one or the other. So conditioned to believe that when the crying is over, then we dance. So conditioned to believe that if I get through this hard time, then okay, phew, I'll allow myself to really feel joy. If I get through this financial stress or this next final season or this relational difficulties, man, don't relational difficulties just weigh us down? If you're having a hard time with someone you love, and we tend to think, oh, if I get through that, then when the suffering is over, then I'll experience joy, right? But that word "and" has changed my life. And I want to share a little bit of that with you today, this idea of holding both. Yesterday I was in a room full of people. We had a meeting, one of the programs that I'm involved with at St. Alphonsus. And I have, in that program, I have 17 colleagues, all of professional colleagues, all of whom were not born in the United States, all of whom their first language is not English, all of whom have experienced trauma and or torture, all of whom are so much smarter about so many things that I am, and who I learn from daily, hourly, as I have the opportunity to walk through life together with them. And we were talking about this thing of holiday time, and this is a group of people extremely culturally diverse, linguistically diverse, and religiously diverse. So they don't all celebrate Christmas personally. But we were just talking about how sometimes at big holiday times, it can be really a holding both time. And holding both is language that we use a lot in my workplace, so they're familiar with that term. And it was so interesting because with all the diversity in that room, every single person thinking of their own holiday times, whether it's Ramadan or whatever festivals or holidays people usually celebrate, some are Christmas celebrators, everyone said, oh yeah, it's like it's this wonderful time and this terrible time. There's some things that bring so much joy and some things that bring so much pain. Many of them talked about the difficulty of being away from loved ones, being away from home, from their first home, at a time when what you think about is being together with those that you love, or thinking about the ones who you wish were here, who are no longer here on this earth during that time. Kind of a universal experience. And the reason for that is because our brains, we're going to do a little bit of neurobiology here, just to help us understand how we were created for all of this, okay? Our brains are networks of associations. Sometimes we like to think of our brains as like organized little file systems and everything has its little place. But it's more like beads on a string. It's more like we all have these associations that our brains are doing all the time. So like, let's say you're sitting at your desk trying to do some homework, and suddenly you realize that your thoughts are like somewhere way off there, maybe back in 5th grade. And you're like, how in the world did that happen? But it's because something reminded you of this, which reminded you of this, which reminded you of this, which reminded you of this. If you could trace it back, you'd go, oh my goodness, right? Our brains are really networks of associations. So for all of us, we have things that remind us of other things. Like my friend, who some word or some thought on her string of beads reminded her of something else. And so that memory was difficult for her. And this is true for all of us. This is why we have our favorite and unfavorite things about the holidays. Because one thing can remind us of another thing. A certain sound, a certain song. You may have a Christmas song that when you hear that song, you just feel warm. Reminds you of sitting there in your home church when you were a kid waiting for them to pass out the little goodie bags after the Christmas program. Maybe it has really warm associations for you. There may be one, though, that has really painful associations. Also smells, sounds of a certain language, so many things that can associate for us. Being in a certain place. That's why often we find ourselves avoiding just going to certain places. I have a friend who has been in this country now about 20 years. And when she first came to this country, she had a really traumatic experience at a medical appointment. And with no interpreter. So trauma upon trauma. And to this day, 20 years later, maybe 21 now, I think, she's told me that she will drive, if needed, 15 or 20 extra minutes to avoid that section of town, of the clinic that happened in, because of the associations that our brains hold, those beads on a string, right? So here's something that can be really helpful. This is what we've noticed for many, many of us. It can be really helpful to understand this thing about associations in our brains. So this is a little thing that comes from actually a form of trauma therapy called EMDR. Some of you might be familiar with that. They kind of coined this phrase, and then we've kind of figured out ways to apply it. And it's called big T, little t. And it's referring to different types of trauma. So big T traumas would be the things that we usually think of when we talk about the word trauma, which, again, I'm not going to tell trauma stories or give examples of trauma, because that wouldn't be trauma safe for us in this room or for the people that I would be telling about. But just to know, when we talk about big T trauma, we're usually talking about the kind of trauma that's like life-threatening or well-being threatening, or that we witness something life-threatening or well-being threatening to another person. In the most recent studies, they're now finding more and more that it's true that actually, especially for the developing brains of children, it actually brings more difficulties to witness the big T trauma of another person, especially if it's a caregiver, than to actually experience the big T trauma. And big T trauma is pervasive. It does not have favorites. It's life on earth. Many, many, many of us have experienced big T trauma in various forms. So that's the life-threatening or well-being threatening form of trauma, okay? So that's all we need to say about big T trauma. Little T trauma are those distressing, disturbing events that happen to all of us every single day. Some more significant than others. You're driving, and someone pulls out in front of you, and you go, and your heart beats really fast, and it kind of gets you for a minute, right? We call that dysregulating you. It dysregulates your emotions. That would be a little T trauma, because it just kind of scared you for a minute, and then you went, oh, phew. You have an argument with someone you love. You're really, really stressed about your test. You have to give a presentation next hour in Mr. Harrod's class, and you're not ready for it. All of the little T, not mentioning any names, all of the little T traumas that happen to us all the time. Then there are more significant little T traumas, the kind that stay with you and that kind of affect how you view the world. So like something maybe that happened to you when you were a kid where you were shamed in front of everyone. I'll tell you a quick example from my own life, just to give you an idea of what little T trauma can be like, right? So this was when I was in first grade. My teacher's name was Mrs. Murdoch. I probably remember that mostly because of this event. I'm sure she was a really nice lady and good teacher, let's say a big and here. I'm sure she was a really nice teacher, and she didn't like the sound of people's feet scuffing. You know how when you walk, if you don't pick up your feet? And picking up my feet is not something I'm good at. I wasn't then, I'm not now. And I'm good at some things, but not that. Well, she had a problem with that. I do not know why. And one day she heard me scuffing my feet across, going like, I don't know, to the pencil sharpener or something. First grade, so I'm 6, right? And she stopped me. And I knew she didn't like scuffing feet because she had told us many times, don't scuff your feet in this class. But that day, something about that apparently was a little T dysregulation for her. And she had me walk around the entire classroom, around the perimeter several times, purposefully scuffing my feet. Thinking, I suppose, if I do this, it will like shame her into never doing that again. That always works real well. That was not a big T trauma. And it was a little T trauma. Because to this day, I notice myself sometimes, if I feel like I've made too much noise in a group of people, taken up too much space, made my presence too known in a group of people, I feel this anxiety. Beads on a string, right? That goes back to that original bead on the string, and other things in life have added to it. Being a woman in leadership, for one thing, adds to that string. You're saying too much, you're taking up too much space. Talking to Christian people about things like racism and white supremacy and white privilege and the things that we need to give up in order to truly represent the love of Christ in the world, you're saying too much. You're making too much noise. You need to quiet down. See the beads on a string? We all have those. I hope you're thinking now of some of those beads on that string for you. This is why when we sometimes don't understand ourselves, we go, why am I having such a strong reaction? That was just a little thing. Well, because you're not just reacting to that bead, you're reacting to all these beads too. So imagine if we just understand this about each other and about ourselves. Here's something really, really important to know. And I do see Derek. Thank you. I do see, oh boy, the time, the clock. Here's something important to know. For people who have survived big T trauma, which is so many of us, for people who have survived big T trauma, where our well-being or the well-being of someone with us was threatened or harmed, for people who have survived big T trauma, little t's, and this is so important, little t's are often experienced as big T's in our thoughts and in our body's response. This is why, for someone who experienced big T trauma in their home, driving home for Christmas, the gut starts to tighten, and the sweat starts to come, and the thoughts start to race, and the hands start to shake, or whatever symptoms it may be. This is why when you've had a disagreement with someone, it was so painful, when you see that person, something in you goes, right? Because your body is experiencing what it experienced before. This is important to understand because we often think about ourselves and each other that we're overreacting. And especially as Christ followers, we often tend to minimize or gloss over or fix those things or talk someone out of hurting. That's why I said it's not my goal to make anyone cry or not cry, but really, as the body of Christ, we've got to stop trying to talk each other out of hurting. Because that is what Jesus came for. We like the shiny nativities, the ones with gold around the edges. Have you ever noticed that? And I am quite certain that those don't represent the truth of the pain and suffering and agony that brought Jesus into the world. But sometimes we forget that Jesus came for the and. We want to gloss over that suffering and pain in Jesus, in ourselves, and in each other. And especially if someone else's pain or suffering makes me feel uncomfortable. Like touches on something that makes me feel defensive. Maybe if someone feels pain because they're experiencing discrimination based on something that I don't experience, then I want to minimize that and go, oh no, you're fine. Oh, you're just imagining things. Oh, don't let it bother you. Oh, it's not really that. Oh, not all white people think that way. You're making that up, right? Why? Because I feel uncomfortable with someone else's pain. We've got to stop doing that to each other on all fronts. Because Jesus came for the and. In fact, Jesus came to be the and. Jesus said in Matthew 12, about Jesus, the prophecy about Jesus, a bruised reed he will not break. A smoldering wick he will not snuff out. Or as the New Living Translation says, he won't put out a flickering candle. But often we see someone bruised around us, and we do step on the bruised reed, or snuff out, or at least ignore the flickering candle. In ourselves, or in each other. This world is a bruised and bent world. And Jesus came. Jesus coming doesn't change the fact that it's a bruised and bent world. It's a holding both. But sometimes we get almost frustrated when the world doesn't kind of go, oh, great, Jesus came, everything's great now. I don't feel any pain anymore. Nobody hurts me. I don't hurt others. What do you mean racism? There's none of that here in this country, right? We want to pretend like because Jesus is here that all that went away, but it's an and. It's a holding both. That's why Jesus coming to this world is so beautiful. If we take out the and, it has no meaning anymore. Jesus came to be the and. If you were hanging around one of those shiny nativity scenes with glowing lights and all the things that we make look so warm and magical, but you were experiencing sorrow, grief, lament, extreme emotional pain, discrimination, would you feel out of place next to a shiny nativity scene? Sometimes I think we're more concerned about maybe thinking that our sorrow is less Christian than everything being merry and bright. Sometimes our worship services reflect that. Sometimes we don't want to lament the pain that's going on in our world, in some cases the pain that we've caused and been part of. We just want the merry and bright because we think that that's more Christian. But here's the reality. Jesus did not come to take away all the world's suffering. The suffering caused by hopelessness of sin and death, yes. But the world's suffering, Jesus did not come to take it away, but to indwell it and to infuse it with meaning. And that happens when he took up his symbol of suffering, the cross, and said, "Follow me." And takes us on that path of healing to the cross ourselves. Where life in this world has brought us all to ask the question, am I not worth loving? If you think about those things that are painful for you, that's the question that they make us ask, right? That's what's so painful about it. Am I not worth loving? That those things would happen to me? If you kind of get through all of it, that's the underlying question that we all need the answer to. Am I not worth loving? And we go to the cross of and that's where the answer is. Those things that have happened to you are painful and you did not deserve them, and they have altered your life, and you are worth loving. The cross is the proof of that. That's what by his wounds we are healed means. You are hurt. You have been hurt. You are hurting. And you are worth loving. That's the and. So I'll just end with this. A few years ago, I was driving at Christmas time, and it was one of those times where with the work that I do, I'd just been involved in a number of situations at once that just involved so much suffering and so much trauma, and just really was feeling that and carrying that with me as I drove at this Christmas time. Just kind of feeling the heaviness and the weight of my own pain and the pain of others that I knew were suffering. And one of the songs came on the radio, which these old Christmas carols don't come on the radio very often anymore. You have to listen to 10 or 12 Rudolphs before you can get to an actual Christmas carol. And this one was "It Came Upon a Midnight Clear," which is really old. Some of you may not be familiar with it at all. But it's talking about that on the night when Jesus was born, that the angels came and sang. And it starts out talking about peace on earth, goodwill toward men. And I'm going to be really honest with you. I was feeling really skeptical about peace on earth and goodwill toward men that day. When that song came on the radio, I almost turned it off because I really felt kind of angry listening to it. I was like, so, right, where is it? Right? Like the things that I'm involved with every day and the things that I hear and the people that I support, you become painfully aware of how little peace on earth there is. So I was just feeling that weight, feeling the heaviness, but I left the song on and kept listening. And fortunately, they played all the verses, because it comes to the place in the last verse where it says, "For those beneath life's crushing load, whose forms are bending low, who toil along the climbing way with painful steps and slow." So now it had my attention, right? There's something here for me. And it finally comes to the very last line, which says, "Oh, rest beside the weary road and hear the angels sing." Oh, rest beside the weary road and hear the angels sing. You know your weary road. You know the things that make you need to pause and rest. You know the things that hurt and the reasons why you need to be allowed to hurt without it being minimized or fixed. Jesus came to be the and. You can rest beside the weary road and just rest. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to earn anything. You don't have to deserve anything. You don't have to explain why you hurt the way you do. You can just rest beside your weary road and hear the angels sing that good news of Jesus coming to earth. So whatever your weary road has been, I hope that today and throughout coming months and years you'll remember that for Christ followers, we get to cry and dance. Because of the cross of and, we cry and dance. we rest and sing. Oh, rest beside the weary road and hear the angels sing. God, we thank you for your love, for being the and. We need you to help us to hold both, the pain and the suffering, the joy and the sorrow, the cross and the empty tomb.